This spring, the Boston Symphony Orchestra presents two programs of music inspired by the works of William Shakespeare. The English composer-conductor Thomas Addis brings a program of music focused on Shakespeare's The Tempest, including scenes from Addis's own opera, The Tempest, as well as Tchaikovsky's tone poem, based on the same play, and incidental music by Jean Sibelius from a production of the play in the 1920s. For the final concerts of the BSO season, May 4th through 7th, the Swiss conductor Charles Dutoit brings Berlioz's epic Romeo and Juliet, which is of course based on the play of the same name. Shakespeare worked toward the end of the 16th century and the first part of the 17th. He wrote Romeo and Juliet by about 1595, and The Tempest was probably the last play that he wrote by himself in about 1611. Music would have been an integral part of the productions of Shakespeare's plays from the beginning. There were songs and often other kinds of music that were written into the plays, and there would have been incidental music to illustrate some of the action of the plays, even in those first productions. When you think of a play like Twelfth Night, which begins, "If music be the food of love, play on," that's a good indicator that there would have actually been music playing for the start of that play. There also would have been music playing probably for the masked ball in Romeo and Juliet, and for Ariel's songs in The Tempest, when Prospero commands Ariel to try and get some of the human characters to do what he wants. Those probably would have been set to specific melodies. Composers, artists, and even other writers since Shakespeare's time have found Shakespeare's works to be irresistible. The music that's based on Shakespeare's works falls into basically 5 or 6 broad categories. There are countless, and I mean countless, settings of Shakespeare's sonnets and other poetry, including lyrics from within some of Shakespeare's plays, and these go right up until the modern times. Another category of works based on Shakespeare is the symphonic poem. Tchaikovsky wrote 3 of these, including Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and The Tempest. These are works in which the themes and the orchestral music is actually tied to actions within the play and evokes the characters and the emotions they portray. Other symphonic poems based on Shakespeare's work include Liszt's Hamlet, Strauss's Macbeth, and Edward Elgar's Falstaff. Another piece that you might consider within this genre as well is Mendelssohn's overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Mendelssohn actually wrote that overture in his teens, and then almost 20 years later he came back to write an entire suite of incidental music to that same play. Incidental music is yet another category of music that can be inspired by Shakespeare. Incidental music essentially means music that is written to accompany a production of the play. That is for entrances and exits, and also for those little songs and other things that might appear within one of the plays. For example, Mendelssohn's Wedding March from The Midsummer Night's Dream would have accompanied the wedding of Theseus and Hippolyta at the end of the play. In the mid-1920s, the great Finnish composer Jean Sibelius wrote a suite of incidental music for a production of The Tempest. This turned out to be about 34 different works, and there are 2 different orchestral suites that can be played alone that we often hear in concert halls. So this is music from late in Sibelius's career, and it represents the kind of character writing that we really find from even his earliest pieces. Another sort of subgenre of incidental music is the film and television soundtrack. Dmitri Shostakovich wrote incidental music and soundtrack music for works based on Shakespeare's Hamlet and King Lear. The 2 theatrical productions were from earlier in his career, and the 2 film soundtracks from later in his career. William Walton also wrote several Shakespeare soundtracks, including those for Richard III, Hamlet, and Henry V. The great Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu wrote the soundtrack for Akira Kurosawa's Ran, which, as you probably know, is based on Shakespeare's King Lear. One of the composers that was most influenced by the works of Shakespeare was the French composer Hector Berlioz from the Romantic era. In fact, Berlioz met his future wife Harriet Smithson after having seen her in a production of Shakespeare's Hamlet, playing the role of Ophelia. And although that marriage didn't quite work out, he really made some hay with his interest in Shakespeare. One of the great works in his entire output is his Romeo and Juliet, which he calls a dramatic symphony. And this is a piece that really maps itself onto Shakespeare's entire play. it's really completely different from almost any other work based on Shakespeare. This is a huge piece. It's about 90 minutes long. It features 3 different soloists, chorus, and orchestra. And interestingly, it has a really strong debt to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So although Berlioz was a French composer, he was very much tied into the tradition of the symphony as exemplified by Beethoven. There have been a lot of ballets based on Shakespeare as well, but by far the most famous music ever written for a ballet based on Shakespeare is Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet from 1938. This is really one of Prokofiev's best and most famous works. Operas and near operas based on Shakespeare's work have been around really since about 50 years or so after the playwright's death. One of the first was Henry Purcell's The Faerie Queene, which is not based on Spenser, but is in fact a kind of Bowdlerization of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And they changed the text considerably, and even the story considerably, when they put that piece together. Composers in later eras writing operas based on Shakespeare's work include Antonio Salieri, who was Mozart's great rival. He wrote an opera based on Falstaff, the character of Falstaff from Henry V and the Merry Wives of Windsor in 1799. And of course, Falstaff was the main character in Verdi's great opera, the last opera he wrote in the 1790s. Verdi was probably the greatest composer ever to treat Shakespeare in opera, and he wrote, in addition to Falstaff, his Othello, and early in his career, an opera based on Macbeth. In the modern era, Shakespeare remains as much of an inspiration for composers and artists as he ever was. One of the greatest operas based on a Shakespeare play is Benjamin Britten's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which uses a libretto by Peter Pears that essentially uses Shakespeare's language. And this is one of the most successful operas based on Shakespeare's own language that we have in the entire repertoire. Other great 20th century and 21st century operas based on Shakespeare include Aribert Ryman's Lear and Thomas Addis's The Tempest, which is a very recent work produced at Covent Garden in 2004. Unlike Britten's opera, Addis's opera uses an all-new libretto with completely new language devised by Meredith Oakes from Shakespeare's original story. None of Shakespeare's language remains in the final libretto. And of course, there are many, many other works from popular culture that are based on Shakespeare as well. Probably one of the most famous is Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story. With operas and symphonic poems and settings of Shakespeare's poems, Shakespeare continues to be an inspiration to artists and composers, even in the modern era. It seems like every few years a new classic inspired by Shakespeare's work is produced. As long as there are new productions of Shakespeare's plays and even movies based on Shakespeare's themes, composers will also be asked to provide music for those productions as well. So there's little doubt that Shakespeare and his works will continue to be a major source of inspiration for composers, artists, and writers well into the future.